Hi, today we're going to talk about point headings. Before you watch this video, you should make sure that you have read the background materials in the lawsuit Wang versus IMDb, because this video will rely on information from those documents. So first, what are point headings? Point headings are the headings for each individual section or subsection of your brief or motion. You can see them here from one page within the argument section of IMDb's motion. They state the key point of the section in a persuasive way, and they are complete grammatically correct sentences. Now, point headings have two major roles in brief writing. First, they actually help or should help you, the writer, put together your argument in a logical way that makes sure that you've covered all of your bases, that all of your arguments have support from sub-arguments, and that you're not missing any pieces. The other essential thing that they do is that they give the judge, who is ordinarily a busy person with a lot of cases on his or her desk, the opportunity and the ability to quickly skim through your arguments to see how all of the pieces fit together. And the judge should be able to do that in your table of contents. This is the table of contents from IMDb's motion for summary judgment in the Wang versus IMDb case. When you draft your point headings, you should, and when you put together your table of contents, you want to make sure that the point headings that are in your actual argument section are reprinted verbatim in your table of contents, and you don't want to leave out any sections or subsections. So the arguments that you see here in the table of contents appear throughout the argument section of the actual brief. To understand how to draft effective point headings, we first need to talk about organization, because point headings are inextricably intertwined with thinking about the organization of your overall argument. So we're going to talk about that first, and then I'll give you some tips on the actual language to use to draft effective individual point headings. So this is an edited version of the point headings from IMDb's motion for partial summary judgment. And again, I have made changes to this from the original version that IMDb actually filed. So notice that it starts with two major arguments. And this is all in outline format too. So you have Roman numeral 1 and 2, and then you have capital A, and then a 1 and a 2, and then it would, if you had more sub-arguments, then you would go to like even further into the outline. When these point headings actually appear in the text of the argument itself, the point headings keep that outline format so that anyone who picks up the brief will immediately know where he or she is within the argument. Okay, so let's look at IMDb's overall organization. Notice first that there are two major arguments, and they each get a Roman numeral 1 or a Roman numeral 2. The first argument that IMDb raises is a defense to the entire lawsuit. And here's what it says. This court should enter summary judgment against Wang due to her unclean hands. And the second argument actually takes on her individual claims that she raised in her complaint. It says IMDb is entitled to summary judgment on both of Wang's claims. So what this tells us, first of all, is that overall organization matters. You need to think about how many major arguments you have. It may be that you have two major substantive arguments that you need to address in order to win. Maybe you have a procedural argument and a substantive argument. What we have here is something different. IMDb actually is using these major arguments to show that it has two separate ways that it can win this lawsuit. That Roman numeral 1 presents its defense. If IMDb can convince the court that the plaintiff's unclean hands are a reason to deny her any relief whatsoever, then IMDb doesn't even need to get to the nitty-gritty of whether there's enough evidence to support her individual claims. So that's its first argument. It's one way it can win. And then, of course, the second way it can win summary judgment is by showing that the plaintiff has not presented enough evidence to satisfy either of those claims. Now, when you are putting together your overall argument, you also need to think about what order to put your arguments in. Sometimes you need to have a procedural argument precede a substantive argument because it's a threshold question. Sometimes, however, you don't have an obvious logical way you need to organize, and so you can try to figure out which of your arguments is the most persuasive, or which one should come first because it's a quicker, easier way for the court to decide in your client's favor. So these are all strategic decisions you need to make when you're putting your point headings and your overall organization together. Okay, so let's look at what IMDb does when it gets to that second major argument, when it tackles the two separate claims that the plaintiff raises in her complaint. So for each of these arguments, IMDb first presents the major point and then has more subheadings to provide reasons why it should win that point. So for that first argument, that the breach of contract claim fails because IMDb didn't breach any legal duty, there are two subsections. IMDb's subscriber agreement specifically authorizes its actions, and Huang can't rely on statements outside of the subscriber agreement to sustain her claims. Now, we would need to know a little bit more about the legal authority and the legal doctrines that underlie these arguments to really have a conversation about how effective these are and as sort of covering all of IMDb's bases. So we're going to assume that these two sub-arguments do everything that IMDb needs to do in order to show that there's no evidence that it breached any legal duty. So what these point headings, A plus 1 and 2, do together is a couple of things. They identify the legal issue that the section discusses. They say, look, this is about the contract claim. They indicate what conclusion the court should reach for that issue. They say the court should find that the contract claim fails. And they set out key reasons that support that conclusion. Let's look at that again. So the A kind of does all of those things. It says, the contract claim fails. It identifies the claim. It says it fails, and it gives the reason. It says that Ms. Huang can't show that IMD breached any legal duty. And then 1 and 2 provide additional, more detailed reasons why there's no evidence that IMD breached its legal duty. The other argument does something slightly different. The heading itself says that Ms. Huang's Consumer Protection Act claim fails. That identifies the issue, Consumer Protection Act claim, and it states what conclusion the court should reach. That claim fails. But it doesn't provide the reasons why. Instead, IMDb uses the subheadings 1, 2, and 3 to provide the reasons. And what it actually is doing here is it's going through the elements of a Consumer Protection Act claim and stating that the first element, which is whether there is a deceptive act or practice, hasn't been satisfied. The second element hasn't been satisfied because there's no evidence that IMDb's conduct impacts the public interest. And the third element hasn't been satisfied because Ms. Huang hasn't established any injury. So this shows how you can use a heading and subheadings together to do those three essential things that point headings should do. Identify the legal issue that the section of the argument discusses, state what conclusion the court should reach, and provide the reasons the court should reach that conclusion. So in terms of subheadings, note that they can do a number of different things. If there are essential elements that a party has to prove, it might use subheadings for each of those elements. If there are multiple different ways a party could win the case or win that argument, each individual subheading might provide a different way that the party could win that argument. That's actually what IMDb is doing with this argument B. Because the plaintiff has the burden of showing that all of the elements of the Consumer Protection Act are satisfied, IMDb could win by showing either 1 or 2 or 3. In other words, it doesn't have to show that there's no unfair or deceptive act and that the conduct didn't impact the public interest and that Ms. Huang didn't establish any injury. It could win if it showed only one of those things, but it has decided to raise essentially 3 separate reasons that it should win the Consumer Protection Act claim. So that's some ways to think about organization. Now let's talk a little bit about the wording of individual point headings. There are a couple of different things that you ideally want to achieve when you're drafting a point heading. First, we've already seen how you want to think about how the headings and subheadings work together to create one cohesive argument so that when that judge sits down and reads just the table of contents, she gets a good sense of what your overall arguments are and how the pieces fit together. So second, clarity and succinctness are essential. You want a point heading to be something that the judge can understand on one quick reading without having to go back and kind of reread it and figure out what the point heading is trying to say. There are a couple of tips that you can use to help you achieve clarity and succinctness. One I've already hinted at, which is to phrase your point heading as an assertion about what conclusion the court should reach, followed by a reason, a clause that begins with the word because, usually. Another helpful thing to remember is that it's usually better to draft in the active voice. That's especially true for point headings. Your sentences will usually be more clear. The third thing is that detail persuades. Sometimes there are really key important facts that really drive home why you should win that argument. And if you can, you want to get those into the point heading. Now note that there is a lot of tension between the second and third points that I've got here on the screen, right? Because the more detail you get into a point heading, the less succinct the point heading is going to be, and you may run into the danger of losing some of the clarity. So if you have to choose, you should always favor clarity overall, because you're not going to persuade anybody if the judge has difficulty even understanding their point you're trying to make. But if you can be clear and appropriately succinct and still have essential details, key facts in your point heading that are really persuasive, then you might want to try doing that. So here's an example that several examples that I've drafted that could have come from Ms. Wang's brief for her motion for summary judgment. So this is a way to incorporate those key facts. So remember, one thing that Ms. Wang has to prove in order to win her Washington Consumer Protection Act claim is that IMDb's deception affects the public interest. So this might be a point heading that addresses that element of that claim. IMDb's deception affects the public interest because IMDb is the primary information source for casting directors, and it therefore enables age discrimination in Hollywood. So this isn't a really succinct sentence, but because of the way it's organized, it's easy to grasp the key information on one reading. It starts with the key assertion, IMDb's deception affects the public interest, and then it has the because clause. Because IMDb is the primary information source for casting directors, and it therefore enables age discrimination in Hollywood. Okay, here's another example. This is where Ms. Wang has to prove that she suffered harm because of IMDb's actions. The revelation of Wang's age caused Wang harm because it resulted in a 50% decrease in auditions and led one casting director to rescind a role Wang had initially been cast in. Again, we see the essential assertion, the revelation of Wang's age caused Wang harm, and then the because clause, because it resulted in a 50% decrease in auditions and led one casting director to rescind a role that she'd initially been cast in. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is, as we've seen, you can sometimes split the first part, the assertion and the statement of what conclusion the court should reach in the main heading, and then use subheadings for the reasons, the because clause. So here's what that would look like if we did that with this point heading. You could have a point heading that said simply that the revelation of Wang's age caused her harm, and then your two key reasons go in your subsections. She experienced a 50% decrease in auditions, and one casting director rescinded a role that she'd initially been cast in. Now, you would only want to do this if you have generally a lot of detailed reasons to support each of those sub-arguments. So this is where you need to make a strategic decision. This might make the point headings easier to read, and it might make it easier to tease apart some of your key evidence that supports the element of harm to the plaintiff. But keep in mind that if you have a lot of little pieces of evidence that together add up to one big compelling argument, that it's often better to marshal all of that evidence in one place instead of splitting it up like this. So this is one option for how to organize this section, but depending on how much evidence there is, it actually might be more effective here for Ms. Wang to have not divided the discussion of the harm she suffered into these two separate subsections. That's a strategic decision that you need to make. Okay, so that's it for point headings. One last thing, drafting effective point headings there's an art to it. You should not think you can sit down and whip them out quickly. You might want to put some placeholder point headings into your argument as you're drafting it, and then really set aside time once you've got the argument itself written to go back and play around and wordsmith the language of the point heading so they work together to make an effective presentation.